Okay. Irwin Braun is an author, lecturer, and a former consultant to the Federal Trade Commission. He was president of his own advertising firm in New York City. He served in the Korean War with the 7th Infantry Division as an intelligence sergeant. He graduated from the City College of New York and New York City Technical College. Okay, so we're going to have a little history quiz for all the lucky people here. Okay, so what president of the United States had the most books written about him? Anybody want to venture a guess? Pardon?
Lincoln.
Who?
Lincoln.
You're right, Abraham Lincoln. He had the most books written about him. Now the second question is, how many books did Lincoln have written about him? Take a guess.
150. No, much more.
How much did he say?
He said 150. Probably 1,000.
Okay, anybody else want to venture a guess?
2,500.
Who's that? Who said 2,500? Well, the answer is 2,200.
Wow.
And the who was the second most books about a president?
Washington.
John F. Kennedy, 1,200 books. Half of them are about, about the assassination. The third was George Washington, and fourth, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 800 books, and still being written. Now, 620,000 men died in the Civil War, fighting for the Union. They died in combat, accidents, starvation, and disease. 2/3 of them who died from diseases and dysentery, not from combat. 2/3 of every soldier who died in the Civil War died from non-combat. Battlefield medicine and sanitation was unheard of in those days. The Civil War was fought in the medical Middle Ages. Of all the battles in the American military history, none would provoke the imagination of historians as what happened in Gettysburg in 1863. It all started when General Robert E. Lee led his Army of Northern Virginia north into Pennsylvania. Lee was the son of Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, a Revolutionary War hero. Lee's idol was George Washington, and he tried to emulate Washington in his conduct, demeanor, and leadership. In fact, he actually married George Washington's granddaughter, Mary Custis. A West Pointer he graduated from, and he went on to distinguish himself in the Mexican War. But when the South seceded from the Union, Lee pledged allegiance to Virginia, not to the United States. So he resigned his commission in the United States Army. And he took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. And he would lead that army for the entire Civil War. Once he took command, he proved himself as a shrewd tactician and a battlefield commander, winning many battles at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, and at many others. In fact, it's the victory at Chancellorsville that led Lee to invade the North. He would meet the Union Army at the crossroads town of Gettysburg, a sleepy little town in Pennsylvania. The Union Army was under the command of General George Meade. Meade was an experienced combat commander, having participated in battles at South Mountain, Chancellorsville, and Antietam. He was given command of the Union Army in 1863. General George Meade was born in Spain in 1815, the son of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant serving in the U.S. government as a naval agent. His family returned to the United States, and he attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He was an artillery officer, or as an infantryman, we call them red lights, because they had a red stripe down their pants. And the first assignment was right here in Florida, fighting the Seminole Indians. He resigned from the Army to work as a civil engineer for the War Department. Finding steady civil employment was difficult, so Meade re-enlisted in the Army, served in the Mexican War, and was cited for bravery at the Battle of Monterrey. When the Civil War broke out, he was appointed a brigadier general. He served in the battles of Chancellorsville, Manassas, Fredericksburg, and was severely wounded at the Battle of Glendale. He was given command of the Union Army 3 days before the Gettysburg. Meade was known for his caution and trying to avoid needless deaths in combat. He wanted to avoid the cost of thousands of young lives in daring warfare. His caution did not sit well with his commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wanted his generals to be pursuing the enemy. The Battle of Gettysburg started on July 1st, 1863, when advanced troops of Lee's army engaged a small detachment of Union cavalry east of Gettysburg. The 75,000 Confederate Army drove the Union troops south of Gettysburg to high ground. Here, they would defend the position with courage and determination. Lee hurled his army against the right, left positions of the Union line. But the Union Army held. On the third day of the battle, Lee ordered General George Pickett to attack the center of the Union line. Pickett's charge would become famous as Lee's last disastrous call at Gettysburg. Pickett's men were slaughtered at the battle. After the battle, Lee ordered his badly beaten army to retreat. Meade delayed his pursuit of Lee's army, and that mistake allowed Lee to withdraw his army intact. Lee's army began the battle with 75,000 men. His army suffered 22,638 casualties, 30% of his troops. Meade had 82,000 men under his command and suffered 17,600 casualties, 21% of his forces. Meade's army suffered less casualties percentage-wise than Lee's, famed Army of Northern Virginia. Meade, in his slow-motion pursuit of Lee, wired headquarters, quote, "I cannot delay to pick up the debris of the battlefield." The debris in this case were the thousands of dead soldiers and dead horses fermenting in the hot July sun. The horses were burned while prisoners covered the bodies of dead troops with blankets and posting the names of the Union dead on boards. There were 9,000 bodies scattered over the battlefield. July heat made the reclaiming of bodies more difficult. Relatives of Union soldiers searched the battlefield for the bodies of their kin. That was common in those days, that relatives would search the battlefields for their loved ones. Bodies and body parts were scattered throughout the entire battlefield. Gettysburg, with 2,500 citizens, was a makeshift burial grounds. The governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, appointed David Wills as representative at the site. Wills was a prominent civic leader, and he quickly ended land speculation by preventing the sale of land needed for a cemetery. Speculators were buying land up, anticipating a huge cemetery. Now you can imagine that people were trying to make money on the dead of the Civil War. Will formed a commission to raise funds for the cleansing of the battlefield. The states were to be assessed according to their representatives in Congress for the cost of the cemetery and the burials. The federal government had no responsibility for the dead. Would you believe that in those days? Will sent out bids on contracts to bury the dead. 34 competitors sent in bids, and the low bid was $154 per body. The government was to ship thousands of coffins necessary for burying the dead. Wills selected William Saunders to create and lay out the cemetery. Saunders was trained in Scotland and employed by the Department of Agriculture. He was deeply involved in the rural cemetery movement at that time, which he adopted for political concerns. By grading the cemetery and hilly incline and arranging the graves in curving ranks, he avoided showing preference treatment to the dead soldiers. Burying bodies by the states they fought for posed a problem. He had to shift bodies as they were processed and organized. Confederate bodies had to be identified and buried. This was difficult since many of the rebels wore Union Army pants and other Union equipment when they died. They didn't have enough clothing of their own. And incidentally, both Lee and Meade offered to resign their commissions after the battle. That's how desperate they were. Neither Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis would accept their resignations, even though Lincoln was angered that Meade allowed Lee's battered army to retreat across the Potomac River. The personal possessions of the dead, like Bibles and diaries, had to be cataloged and labeled for safekeeping in case relatives sought them. Body parts were hard to identify and placed in mass burial graves. Caskets were placed on wagons and taken to their designated sites, returned by the states that the dead soldiers fought for. Wills gave considerable consideration how to dedicate the cemetery that would contain the dead. He felt artful words were necessary to sweeten the poison air of Gettysburg, end quote. He asked the three leading American writers at that time for contributions. They were Longfellow, Whittier, and Bryan. All three poets turned him down. The normal procedure for such an occasion to have speakers who could deliver an eloquent address of great length. That was expected in the 19th century. A talk of several hours was customary and anticipated by the audience. After all, the crowds that heard the famed Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858 sat through 3 hours engagements. Now, one of the leading orators of that era was Edward Everett. An Ivy League educated, he had a PhD from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He was a scholar and a diplomat, and he can enthrall an audience with his oratory for several hours. He always delivered his speeches from memory. He used no notes, so he was the obvious choice for David Wills. Everett had previously consecrated the Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill battlefields of the Revolutionary War. This raised the fame of and awareness of those sites because of his oratory. Everett was invited on September 23rd to appear on October 23rd for the dedication. But he asked for more time since he researched his speeches meticulously. A month later, President Lincoln was invited with other dignitaries and other officials. Lincoln was informally invited to speak through his friend and bodyguard, Ward Lamon, on October 30th. Yes, Lincoln actually had a bodyguard, would you believe it? But this is another story. Lamon told a newspaper reporter that Lincoln accepted the invitation, since it never came directly from the sponsors of the event. Cemeteries such as Gettysburg were a local responsibility. As I said, the federal government was not expected to pay for anything. So Lincoln took no offense in the second-hand invitation. He was expected to deliver only a few offhand remarks to officially open the cemetery. And he wanted to promote the myth that Gettysburg was a great Union victory. This was part of the propaganda campaign to say that the North was winning the war. Also, there's an upcoming election in Pennsylvania, and Lincoln was seeking to rally the different Republican factions. Yes, Lincoln was a Republican. Lamon, Lincoln's bodyguard, told him that they expected a tremendous crowd. So Lincoln knew this was a unique opportunity to redefine his goals for the war. Because traveling on the railroad was very unreliable in those days, with constant breakdowns, Lincoln decided to leave Washington a day earlier. Also planning to attend were state delegations, clergy, civic organizations, military detachments, and bands. They would charter trains to take them to Gettysburg. In addition, also planning to attend were 10,000 people, all headed for a tiny town in central Pennsylvania with little or no resources or facilities to accommodate such a huge crowd. Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, was hysterical about her husband leaving so soon after they lost their son Willie. Incidentally, Lincoln had 4 sons. Only one lived to adulthood, and that was Robert Lincoln. In preparing his speech, Lincoln worked not on the back of an envelope on the train as we learned in school. Instead, he actually started to work on it on the way to a photographer's shop in Washington. He also continued working on the speech, writing on a piece of cardboard on the train to Gettysburg. He wasn't finished, so he worked on the speech in David Wills's house on the night and morning before the dedication. The presidential train stopped in Baltimore to pick up dignitaries, and there was a good deal of talk about the war and the upcoming election. On the train trip from Washington to Gettysburg on November 18, Lincoln told his secretary, John Hay, that he felt weak. The next morning, he told John Nicolay, his other secretary, that he was feeling dizzy. It turns out that he had a very mild case of smallpox. In the railroad car, the president rode with 3 members of his cabinet: William Seward, John Usher, and Montgomery Blair, and several foreign officials and other dignitaries. Lincoln's train arrived in Gettysburg at dusk, and he's met at the station by Everett and Wills. And they escorted him 2 blocks to Wills's home, where dinner was waiting with dozens of guests. Lincoln's black servant took his luggage to the second-floor bedroom where he would sleep. It had a view of the courthouse square. Bedrooms for all the guests were in short supply. So Governor Curtin had to share a bed with Wills. William Saunders spent the night sleeping in a chair in a crowded parlor. Military bands serenaded the president in the square under his window. He was asked to speak to the crowd and he said, "I have no speech to make. In my position, it is important that I not say foolish things. If you can help it, it is often that the only way to help it is to say nothing at all." That's something our current president could learn. Lincoln was also given a tour of the battlefield with Seward. He was familiar with all the fighting in the battles at Gettysburg. He asked William Saunders about Round Top, Culp's Hill, and he was familiar with the lay of the land and its topography. Lincoln was accompanied by his secretary, John Hay. Horses were assigned to all the dignitaries. Carriages and wagons weren't used because they would clog the roads and create a traffic problem. Lincoln was wearing a mourning band on his hat for his dead son, Willie. A sanitation tent was erected near the speaker's platform for Edward Everett. Everett was 69 years old and had kidney problems, so he had to relieve himself before and after the 3-hour ceremony. Meanwhile, the burial site was not finished. Only 1/3 of the bodies had been buried, so marshals were brought in to keep the crowds away from the burial areas. The crowd would be almost 20,000 people. The program began at 12 noon with music by Birchfield's band, a prayer by Reverend Stockton, the 2-hour oration by Edward Everett, additional hymns and incidental music, and finally dedicatory remarks by the president. When Everett spoke, he placed his thick text on a little table in front of him and then refused to look at it, delivering it from memory. He described the battle, excoriated the rebels for atrocities, justifying the fact that many Confederate bodies were still not buried. Telling the story was like a modern docudrama on television, based on investigative reporting. Lincoln and his secretaries praised Everett's speech as good theater and fine prose. When Lincoln rose to speak, he moved 2 sheets of paper of his pocket and delivered this most famous speech in American history. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in the largest sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, has consecrated it for us, above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us. For from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause in which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we are highly resolved these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln's voice was a high tenor that had carrying power. Everyone heard him in the huge crowd. His delivery was emphatic, and he was interrupted 5 times for applause. Lincoln was an experienced orator and great raconteur, and he spent many hours studying the speeches of Shakespeare. Short as speech was, the exact wording was hard to pin down. What is the actual speech that Lincoln gave? They know that Lincoln departed from his original text. There were 4 known newspaper reporters copying the speeches. They had included Joe Gilbert of the Associated Press and Charles Hales of the Boston Daily Advertiser. Joe Gilbert actually consulted Lincoln's delivery text after the ceremony, which makes his version more authentic for scholars. But Lincoln may have departed from it when he actually gave the speech. There are 4 revised speeches that appeared later, determining the actual one become a field day for historians in the future. There are 5 known copies of the speech in Lincoln's handwriting, each with a slightly different text and named after the people he gave them to. The speeches, for all its artistry and eloquence, does not address the most difficult issues of the historic moment. Gettysburg is not mentioned, nor slavery, nor the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation is not mentioned. The great task mentioned in the address is the preservation of self-government. When Lincoln finished his speech, the crowd was dismayed by Lincoln's short performance to the point they didn't know how to respond. Was that all they asked? A photographer expecting Lincoln to give a long speech delayed setting up his camera and equipment so that there was only one photo of Lincoln giving his famous address taken at a great distance of at least 100 feet. The New York Times, covering the event, placed the story on page 1 with the headline, "Immense Number of Visitors, Oration by Honorable Edward Everett, President Lincoln, Mr. Secord, and Governor Seymour." And the myth that Lincoln was disappointed in the result had no basis. He had done what he had come to do. In a letter to Lincoln following the following day, Edward Everett praised the president for his eloquent and concise speech, saying, quote, "I should be glad that I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Reactions to Lincoln's address the following day in the press were mixed. They fell along partisan lines. The Republican newspapers praised it. The Democratic papers abhorred it. Some newspapers failed to report on Lincoln's speech altogether. They reprinted sections of Everett's speech instead. The exact wording of the speech is in dispute among scholars and historians to this very day. The transcriptions published in newspaper accounts of the event and even handwritten copies by Lincoln himself differ in their wording, punctuation, and structure. Each of the 5 known manuscripts of the Gettysburg Address is named for the persons who received it. John Nicolay and John Hay, his 2 secretaries, Everett, Bancroft, and Bliss. Copies were written for charitable purposes long after November 19th event. Most often reproduced version of the Gettysburg Address was written by Lincoln in 1864. It is named after Alexander Bliss. He was a colonel, and he was stepson of George Bancroft, a historian, called the Bliss version. Bancroft asked Lincoln for a copy to use as a fundraiser for wounded soldiers. It is the only copy signed and dated by Lincoln himself, and is on display in the Lincoln Room in the White House. All 272 words used by Lincoln were elements of the language in all his prior oratory and intellectual labors up to Gettysburg. In the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, there is a Lincoln Gettysburg Address memorial that has a bust of Lincoln and his famous words in bronze on the wall. It was also carved into the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and in other memorials following Lincoln's assassination in 1865. And for all the millions of American children who had attended elementary school and had to commit these famous words to memory, there'd be a sense of accomplishment and pride in being an American. Later in the 19th century, Americans would rediscover Lincoln's remarks and find the essence of our country there. And to this day, 155 years later, the event still resonates with Americans as who we are. That's it. Thank you. Any questions, remarks, comments? Yes?
Was Gettysburg the turning point of the war?
Pardon?
Was Gettysburg the turning point of the war?
Well, it was the last time that Lee would invade the North. The war ended 2 years later. So the war ended in 1865. So the war, when we went to school, we always thought the war ended after we had the Battle of Gettysburg. It did not. It went on for 2 more years. But Lee's army would never attempt to evade the North. He would, then on, he was trying to defend the South. Yes?
Prior to Gettysburg, wasn't the South having the major victories of the war?
Oh, the South had a lot of major, they had a lot of victories in the war.
Prior to Gettysburg?
Yeah, prior to Gettysburg. And, you know, there were many victories. The South had victories, you know, but they weren't like turning points. They weren't turning points.
Just
Yes.
on that point, at the same time that Gettysburg, Grant also won Vicksburg.
Yes, right.
So
What do you mean at the same time, before or after?
that weekend, that same weekend.
Yeah. Okay. Ulysses Grant was in charge of the West,
Right.
and he was he actually divided the South by capturing the Mississippi River,
Right.
and he captured Vicksburg, which was the last holdout on the Mississippi. And that was a turning point also, because the South was now divided in two. And of
Many
course,
historians think that was more important victory.
of course, the turning point was Lincoln bringing Grant to take charge of the Union Army. And Grant was a no-nonsense general, and he just pursued Lee until it ended.
And the other thing, at the time, it was just seen as a battle. It wasn't seen as a turning point at the time.
No,
It
just
was just another battle.
no, it was the most casualties. I mean,
Yes.
but the Civil War, there were tremendous casualties. 600,000 people died. You know, it was the bloodiest battle of American history. So, how many people learned in school that Civil